So I want to introduce Rob, who is the amazing artist behind the Americans Who Tell the Truth series. He's blessed us with a few of his portraits all the way from Maine. And he's going to talk a little bit about the project and also his latest portrait, which you are all here to see the unveiling of. So, Rob, turning it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Haymarket House. And what a pleasure to be here. And it's always a thrill, and also the tensest time of my work as an artist is an unveiling. I mean, I never know what people are going to think of the next portrait, and especially the person. It's probably Rubaii, who's sitting right here. But before I introduce her, I want to talk a little bit about the background of this. I always feel it's really important for me to describe where this came from. Because I'm a self-taught artist. I live in a little tiny town on the coast of Maine. I was never a portrait painter until 21 years ago. I was, for lack of a better term, a surrealist. I used art to explore mystery and ambiguity. The idea that I would paint didactic art of any kind was anathema to me. Just, no, can't do that. But, you never know what's going to happen and how you need to react to it. And so what happened to me was, right after 9/11, when the propaganda began, actually within a few hours almost, with Donald Rumsfeld talking about trying to tie Iraq into the taking down of the towers and Al-Qaeda, and, weapons of mass destruction. It was like they had it all planned out. And in fact, they did. But that was, as that propaganda began to build over the next few months, I started to become a person that nobody, even my lovely partner Gail, could live with. I was so angry that this was happening again during my lifetime, that this country was doing this kind of thing, and that they were getting away with it, that the major media in this country was not fact-checking, as they seem to be doing a lot of these days. They were not fact-checking what was being said, and they were cheerleading, in fact, for this war. And the anger I had was, I guess one part anger, was another part grief. The thought of the victims who were going to be. I mean, not just Iraqi victims, but American victims. I mean, American soldiers were being betrayed by their own government again. And I thought, I kept thinking, what can I do besides rant, and drive people crazy around me? And finally, an answer came to me, which was that I needed to exercise Dick Cheney and George Bush and Rumsfeld and that whole crowd from my heart and my head, and replace them with Americans who made me feel, good about this country. In some way, proud, if we are proud of the country, but that made me feel good. And the first thing I did was I looked up on my own studio wall and saw this quote from Walt Whitman that I put up there years and years ago. "This is what you shall do. Love the earth, the sun, and the animals. Despise riches. Hate tyrants. Argue not concerning God. Take your hat off to nothing known or unknown." By which he meant nobody needs to do this to anything else. Anybody, anything, that everybody is essentially equal. And he understood, 150 years ago as a poet, that our survival and our health and our sustainability would depend on the recognition that everything is in a relationship with equality. And if we don't honor that, we will not survive on this planet. So anyway, I painted him. I felt better. And I actually did. Because this project really started as an art therapy project for myself. I just needed to heal myself in relationship to this country. I needed to heal the kind of forced complicity that we all go through when the government commits crimes. Is that as citizens we are suddenly made complicit in these crimes unless we find some way to stand against them and make that very obvious. And you also feel incredibly alienated from the country because of what it's doing and the way it's trashing its own ideals. And so I thought maybe that's all I need to do is paint this one portrait. Walt Whitman had lifted me up, saved me a little bit. And then a few days later, I was ranting again, and Gail said to me, "Why don't you paint another portrait?" She said, "You were such a nice guy there." And there was this little moment of epiphany, and I looked at her and I said, "I'm going to paint 50 portraits." You know, at this point, well, it was the first one ever done. I never thought I'd do it. I'm going to paint 50 portraits. I'm going to call them Americans Who Tell the Truth, and then I'm going to give them all away. I mean, it just happened like that, the whole thing. And I set out to do it. And so I started with all these 19th century figures. I painted Frederick Douglass, Susan B. Anthony, Jane Addams, you know, Mother Jones, you know, on and on through the 19th century. And then I started to work up into the 20th century. And I realized this is amazing what I'm learning about all these people that I knew as names or as icons. I knew nothing really about the quality of their lives, where their courage really was, what it had to be based in, you know, the kind of perseverance they had, you know, how did they do that? And then also how flawed they were, that these were real people. You know, they weren't people we need to put on pedestals. In fact, it's the opposite. We need to look at them as real people because that allows us to actually use them as models for ourselves, who are also flawed people. And it was the way I was learning about history and how things change and how people stand up against injustices of various kinds, and also why they are there. I mean, the important thing to do is when you start to learn this stuff, it's not just what people did, but what other people did in order to consolidate their power. You know, why this was necessary in a country where most people simply believe in a certain set of ideals, but actually make it impossible for those to be realized for most people. So that became fascinating for me, and it just kept leading me on and on and on. And pretty soon, people started asking me, you know, would I come and talk about some of these people I painted? Would I come to a school? Would I put them in a church? You know, things like that. And what began as this little project where I thought I'd have a bunch of paintings in the basement and I'd go and visit them once in a while, get some advice about how to live. You know, all of a sudden they started to travel, and they became the director of my own life. So, by the way, I want to tell you a little story. We were just looking up the name of Derek Jensen. Anybody know Derek Jensen? He's writing an extraordinary writer about culture, politics, and history, and the relationship with nature in this country. I painted his portrait a few years ago. I went out to Minnesota to meet him. I kept hoping he'd come to the East Coast, and he never seemed to do it. So I saw he was talking at McAllister, and I flew all the way out there just to meet this guy so I could paint his portrait. And if you haven't read The Culture of Make-Believe or Language Older Than Words, I really recommend it. These are profound and fascinating books. Wonderful, exciting reading. Anyway, he started a talk he was giving. He was handed a bottle like this. And he did this elaborate, slow motion, you know, very actorly kind of thing, where he slowly unscrewed the cap of the bottle. Then he held it up and he said, "Anybody," and then he took a long drink. And then he said, "Anybody who will drink water out of a plastic bottle will suffer any indignity." I'm there taking notes and writing this down. Man, I thought, you know, in an interesting way, when I, you know, just before I was talking about complicity, this makes us complicit. You know, almost every system we live by makes us complicit, and there's so little we can do directly about so many of these big systems, whether it's transportation or energy, or, you know, you name it, or militarism. But we need to be trying to do to separate ourselves from these policies and to make sure that other people understand what they are. So I'm going to introduce Collie. I mean, I'm going to tell you one other story first. There are now, you know, I didn't stop when I got to 50. There are now close to 270 of these portraits. They've been in now, I think, close to 40 states. They've been in colleges, museums, libraries, churches, meeting houses, pizza places, movie theaters. I actually like them best when they're in places like that. This is democratic art. It needs to be where people are, and it has nothing to do with elitism at all. So, but each painting has a story. And when I get, and we have now built up a lot of educational curriculum around the stories, and working particularly in middle school and high schools with these. And one of the stories I love telling, and actually Bill and I were talking about Claudette Colvin earlier today, just a little bit. You know, does anybody know who she was? Yeah, great. Somebody. You want to say something about her?
Yeah, she was in Montgomery, and she was the Rosa Parks before Rosa Parks, but she was really young. She was a high school student, and so actually community decided it's too much. But she then, so she, didn't do, isn't famous for that, but became a big influence and big activist in the civil rights movement after that.
Yeah, that's, so in March of 1955, Rosa Parks was December 1st, 1955. August of 1955 was the killing of Emmett Till. So that year was full of lots of stuff. But what happened was with Claudette Colvin, she was a 15-year-old girl going to a black high school in Montgomery, separate but equal era. And they had just had Negro History Week. That was, Carter Wood's great black educator, had started this attempt at teaching Negro history, teaching black history, to try to combat internalized racism, so that, black people would know their own history a lot more and have a lot more respect for themselves rather than see themselves through the eyes of white racists. So anyway, so she had just gone through that and was sitting on this bus, and it was very much similar to what happened to Rosa Parks. She was sitting in the front row of the black section, and actually the seat across from her was open, across the aisle. And the front filled up with white people, and the bus driver pointed at her and told her to go back and go to move to the back of the bus. And, the reason that she would have to move is the law said that a black person couldn't sit across the aisle from a white person because it implied equality. So she was told to move. She didn't. She said, the Constitution allows me to sit here. Imagine being a 15-year-old girl in 1955 saying that in that kind of situation. You knew, certainly you knew, how dangerous that was. You get killed, your house, your school, your church get bombed, anything could happen. And probably anything would happen, right? So anyway, she says, the Constitution allows me to sit here. She was ordered to move. She refused. She kept refusing. And they had no cell phones. The bus driver has to stop the bus, get off the bus, find a phone, call the police. They come, they drag her off the bus. The whole time she's saying, the Constitution allows me to sit here. And she's taken to jail. There's some really interesting things about this. The case that went to the Supreme Court about bus segregation was not Rosa Parks' case. It was Claudette Colvin's case bundled with a couple of other women who had also done this. It was that case that actually changed the segregation laws on the buses. A 15-year-old girl, had catalyzed that moment. This is important. I've painted now a lot of young people who've done things like that we don't read about in our history books. And how important that is for kids to know those stories so that they can have those present to them when they need to do things that all of us do. And that's become for me, this project has become a lot about, is giving people models of how you can behave in those kinds of stressful moments. When a man named Philip Hose wrote a book about Claudette Colvin just a few years ago, it won the National Book Award. And he was invited to New York to receive his award. And he called up Claudette and said, "No, our book won the award, come to the meeting, or come to the event." And she's now in her 70s living in Brooklyn. And so she comes. And after he receives the award and gives his talk, the reporters there all ran up to her, not to him. And the question was, what were you thinking? Why didn't you move? You knew how dangerous, what your parents must have been telling you, right? Just like parents would tell kids today, there's a white cop, don't mess around, just do what he says, walk away. Don't walk away, whatever you do, show them your hands. Anyways, so what she says is, I wanted to move. She said, I started to get up, and I felt Harriet Tubman's hand on my shoulder, pushing me back down. And then she said, I started to get up again, and I felt Sojourner Truth's hand on my other shoulder, pushing me back down. She said, I had to ask myself, what would they do? There was only one answer. She said, history glued me to my seat. History glued me to my seat. And for me, that's what this is about. You know, is trying to, you know, give a little glue, squirt a little glue out there to cement people to their seats when they're in those kinds of moments, when they need to, you know, even when they're, you know, obviously scared, act with some courage for a cause. And so, as you can see, this all started with the attack on Iraq, and which, you know, is still, I mean, the damage from it goes on and on and on, and will, because it's never acknowledged, or there's no accountability for it. And I was thinking about that this last summer when the United States passed, Congress passed the PACT Act, you know, which was to give some kind of medical care, or more medical care, to veterans, American veterans, who'd been exposed to burn pits, and all the toxins and diseases they were causing. And I thought, that's good, but somebody's being left out here. You know, they're not talking about the people at the other end of this, you know, who can't come home after a tour in Iraq. And those are the Iraqis, you know. And so, just by chance, just when I was thinking that, I'm listening to the radio, and I hear Rubaii being interviewed. And here's this woman, you know, this anthropology professor from Purdue, who's been spending an awful lot of her life in Fallujah, in that part of Iraq, studying the toxic effects of American militarism on Iraqi people. The incredible amount of a high level of birth defects, cancers, respiratory diseases, childhood diseases, all these things going on. And she's not only studying this and trying to tell people the truth about it, but she also is working on reparations to take care of some of the people who've been so severely injured. I was blown away. I thought, you know, if this project is about any truth-telling, it has to be about telling those kinds of truths. About, you know, we make these wars, whether they're in Vietnam or Central America or wherever they are, and then we walk away from them. And it's like, well, if we're out of the area, it's over. It's over. Nobody else is being, you know, endangered by any of this stuff. And of course it's not. The people who are there the war goes on and on and on. And it keeps damaging and killing and, you know, terrorizing people. So anyway, I went online, I looked up her name in Purdue, found her email address, and wrote her this probably curious email. Some people think I'm stalking them when and said what I was doing and that I wanted to paint her portrait. And a few days later, I got this wonderful note back from her. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to unveil her portrait, and then she's going to read the quote that's on it, because you can see in each one of these portraits. And by the way, you know, as I said, there are 270 portraits or something like that. I asked her who were some of the people that she'd like to be in the company of for this event. And so we brought 5 other portraits for her to be around. And so we're going to unveil it. She's going to read her quote, and then I'm going to have Kali talk a little bit about what she does and what it means to her, and hopefully what it means to all of us, and also some things that we can do about some of this stuff. She has not seen this portrait. I think Gail's probably the only person in the room who has seen this portrait. I'm beginning to sweat bullets.
It's going to be all right.
No, let's do this.
Okay.
The opposite.
That's gorgeous. Wow.
Well, what I saw when I was looking at your face was, I think,
can it translate to is the kind of compassion that you act with. And that was what I'm going to paint. And I
That's
hope,
really
hope that that's there for you.
I love it, thank you.
Thank you. Would you want to read it?
Sure. Liberal democratic empires frame imperial terror as defense, and the self-defense of targeted people as terrorism. While the U.S. empire may speak of the sanctity of life, its implementation centers on the sanctity of lethal force, not only by bombs and bullets, but also by triggering a cascade of public health crises and ecological collapse.
So this portrait now becomes part of this group of portraits, and it will travel around the country. I mean, there are, I think, actually 6 shows of them out right now in different places, schools and churches and things, and they keep going and coming. And then people will see this. It won't be posted on the website till probably next week sometime. But then other people will see it and they choose it to go to. So Eric, talk a little bit about your work.
Sure. Well, since democracy is the theme, I guess I'll start with my favorite quote from one of my buddies, Hamid, who's a date farmer that I spent a lot of time with, who's contending with some of the environmental devastation we're talking about. He said Iraq wasn't bombed into the Stone Ages, it was bombed into the future, and you're next. And I think that that reflects my relationship with American empire to a T. 9/11 happened when I was in junior high, so by the time I voted, the condition of U.S.-Iraq relations defined democracy for me. So the first president I voted, the election that I voted for first, we elected George W. Bush again, who continued to perpetuate war, and it went on and on. So the entire course of my political life as an American citizen was in direct relation to what the U.S. was doing in Iraq and, of course, elsewhere. And I think at that point in time, I became aware that the illusion of liberal democracy is that it is inherently a good thing and that it isn't predicated on genocide and slavery to self-perpetuate, and that if I wanted to understand what it meant to participate in democracy, it would have a lot more to do with refusal and punishment than elections. And so I think that this is kind of a fitting company for me to keep, because these, of course, are all people whose citizenship status has been challenged in part because of their intense exercising of democratic values, in spite of the sham of democracy that we live in. And then that prompted me in the long run to understand that the real impact of the U.S. occupation of Iraq in 2003 started decades before in the 90s and continues now into the 20-teens and 2020s. And it's not by bombs and bullets. That's actually something people can manage to recover from. Even if millions of people are killed, people come back. And even if your farm becomes a bomb crater, trees grow back. What's killing and destroying life in Iraq now is the chemical and economic legacy, the kind of regimes that were put in place in the name of liberal democracy, not in the name of war. It was Order 1 to 100 that privatized the Iraqi community and the Iraq's economy, that gutted its healthcare system so that the children who are born sick can't actually get the medical care they need to recover from the chemicals that were dropped on them. And that have gutted the farming community's capacity to recover by reducing their access to public money, public land, and seeds, that has consistently structured the economy of Iraq to drain resources, leaving people unemployed and impoverished, lowering the education level, and depleting the kind of cultural integrity that such a diverse society has been able to maintain for civilizations. And so, in a way, I think many of us have shifted from critiquing war to critiquing militarized peace. And that is exactly what I think the environment in Iraq and my focus on the environmental effects of war is helping me understand better and better. That under US empire, peace looks a lot like war, whether you're an indigenous person who's having to continue to survive without any reparations or reconciliation for the genocide that made what we call America? What does peace look like to the descendants of slaves who are continuing to have to stay glued to their seats in order to have rights? I'm not quite sure what we mean when we talk about democracy, except when we look at the kind of obstinate refusal that you're trying to model for us. Yeah. That's what I've got.
I want to just quickly introduce, I'm going to say 3 other people in the room who are also portraits of mine, whose portraits aren't here, but they're here. And I'll introduce them in a second. But first, in case you don't know who these people are, everybody knows who Edward Snowden is. And it's interesting that a colleague asked for him to be part of this, because of all the people I painted, probably he's the one who gets asked the least to go anywhere else. He usually stays home in my basement. People are afraid of him and suspicious of why I paint a traitor. And it's so important to me to be able to actually talk about it, because, as we like to say, that the just power of a government is given to them by the consent of the people. And that consent, if it's going to be just, depends on the people knowing the truth. And the way it is so often managed in this country is that people give consent on the basis of things they don't know the truth about, or because they've purposely been withheld from them. It's top secret. They can't know. And so then they have to be in this kind of situation in relationship to their own government that, well, we have to trust those people to do the right thing. They're good Americans, they must be doing it, even though they can't tell us why they need to do that, or they are going to do it. And that completely destroys it, as you say, the whole idea of what a real democracy would be when people actually know enough and are educated highly enough to make those decisions, because of what they know, rather than what has been kept from them. And they've been told it's okay if they don't, and in fact they shouldn't. So
I would just add to that one of the shifts is the shift from peacetime, from war to peacetime security. And Snowden was critiquing the security regime, surveillance, and the kind of things that are supposed to happen in the name of keeping peace. And that's actually the kind of fascist repression that prevents us from surviving.
right, but all of us are being surveilled, and we need to accept that as a good idea in order to, catch out whoever might be the nefarious terrorists amongst us. In Dar Jamail, actually, you want to talk about Dar a little bit?
Sure.
You probably know better than I do.
Yes, I know Dar. He was one of the only unembedded journalists, speaking of keeping people uninformed, to be in Iraq at a time when the U.S. government decided that embedding journalists would be more effective than what happened in Vietnam when people started seeing pictures they couldn't see. And so he directly confronted the U.S. policy of no bodies on TV, no reports of Iraqi civilian deaths. And so he's been a champion of that kind of truth-telling, and now he's shifted in focus to journalism on climate change, which I think for many of us is directly related.
He was working as a mountain guide in Alaska when the Iraq War started, and was just intolerably aware that we weren't being told the truth. And so he created his own press badge. He was not actually, didn't have one. And he went to Amman, Jordan, showed them this bogus badge, and they let him in the country. And he did the first interviews with Iraqis who'd been in Abu Ghraib, and started, telling that story. Dr. Mona Hanna-Atisha, she's the Iraqi-American from Flint, Michigan, pediatrician who blew the whistle on the lead in the water there. And that was, she, like actually many of the people I painted, has become a friend and a person that we work with often, bring to events to speak. And it was in this era of demonization of immigrants, it was so important for me to paint this immigrant woman who's saving the lives of American children, and say, hey, wait, take a look at this, what's really wrong with this story? And, she is, I don't know, if you don't know her story, I'm sure everybody knows something about her. But she wrote a great book about what she went through as she was, deciding to tell the truth, and then how she was demonized as a woman, as a scientist who couldn't possibly know what she was talking about. All the things that were done to Rachel Carson, back in the 60s. Same kind of thing. But she persisted, and of course, she finally prevailed. Let's see. This was Edward Said. These boxes back here are the boxes, you can see, are the boxes the portraits ship in, and they have 2 padded slots. So that when I ship portraits, I'm always thinking, well, who would like to be with whom else? I really didn't talk about for 2 or 3 days in the dark. And sometimes I've done some matchmaking. I've done all kinds of things. But I asked Kali who she wanted to travel with, and she said Edward Said. So say a few words.
With no hesitation.
No hesitation.
All right, well, what do I like about Edward Said? To me, I've read, I think, everything he's ever written. Edward Said taught me what it means to be an intellectual without being an intellectual snob, and what it means to leverage a critique of, what it means to put a mirror up to power as a technique for allowing all of us to understand how violence is refracted in our personhood and our sense of self and in our denial of what we do. And he also is someone whose personal life honestly, I didn't know he was an American citizen until I saw him in your portrait gallery. He is someone for whom nationalism is not a useful analytic for understanding what it means to practice democracy or to practice citizenship in the world. And I think he symbolizes the future in that probably in the next 10 or 20 years, there will be far more people who don't have citizenship anywhere than people who do. And so to me, he reflects the kind of wisdom and analytical skill that's going to be required of all of us more and more.
And Naomi Klein, I assume that Naomi Klein has been right in this building to speak, and she's one of the great activist writers today. She's sort of a dual citizen of Canada and the United States. I think her parents fled the United States because of Vietnam, and so she was born there, but I think she has a dual citizenship. Actually, even though I call us Americans to tell the truth, there are a few people. I don't know if Camilo Mejia has ever been an American citizen, even though he was an American soldier in Iraq, and things like that. And about Edward Said, I'm not actually sure, but of course he spent most of his adult life and his professional life, not just as a writer and activist, but as a great musicologist and piano player, extraordinary person. But Naomi Klein, let me just, the quote that's on her portrait is so significant in terms of where we are today. And have been for a long time. She said, "Our economy is at war with many forms of life on Earth, including human life. What the climate needs to avoid collapse is a contraction of humanity's use of resources. What our economic model demands to avoid collapse is unfettered expansion. Only one of these sets of rules can be changed, and it's not the laws of nature." And that puts it about as explicitly and direly, is there a word? Direly? And then, we have, there's Bob Kohler, is sitting right here. He's a journalist, writes a column every week called Common Wonders, which also shows up on Common Dreams. And I've been reading for years, who talks about war making and peacemaking and restorative justice and a whole host of other things as concisely and passionately as anybody. And I love reading that, and I love the fact that you just keep at it. I mean, as we know so much about whether it's organizing or any of the work, it's refusing to give up. It's the perseverance of it that often is the thing that turns the tide. or at least allows us to have some dignity in the way we live, if we don't give up. And Bob does that. It's wonderful. And if you don't know his writing, I encourage you to look it up, Common Wonders.
Common Wonders.
Common Wonders. Yeah. So thank you, Bob. Leon Jones, this man sitting right here. I painted him years ago. Some of you probably know his story, but you know, when he was, 13,
Yeah.
he was approached by the group that eventually became StoryCorps on the radio to tell the story of what was happening inside the Ida B. Wells housing development. The violence of it, the broken homes of it, the anger of it, the drugs, the this and that. And they had found this incredible 13-year-old boy who went in there and interviewed people and told the story with his friend Lloyd, who took pictures. When he was 17, they put together a book called Our America, after interviewing, again, after a group of boys killed another boy by dropping him out of a window. Anyway, I heard the story, I read his book, and I found a way to get in touch with him. And then I came here to meet him, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And say a few words about yourself and your work.
I don't know what to say. I mean, I think this is I'm 44 now, so it's like, I'll be 45 this year, so every time I hear about myself at 13, I'm being 44, but being a part of something like this, here with Bill and Bernadine, who I've known for many years, to be here with you. I live in Palos Hills, and it's a huge Middle Eastern community here. And so to be here and see these faces, and then be in a community that's more Middle Easterners than the community I grew up in, but yet to see the humanity of this is pretty cool. Because I mean, I want to make sure that somehow you're a community of young ladies that you know you in Palos Hills for the work that you've done in connecting that. And then you went to Purdue, my nephew played down there, played football down there. And just to see us here with all of this craziness in the world celebrating the people that actually give us an opportunity to say we live.
Yeah, and if you don't know, the Allen's book, that Our America book, it's a really important book to read because I think that what you did and the way you tell that story and the way you show, how the internalized racism, internalized destruction of oneself.
I think at 30, though, it's a different interpretation for me.
Yeah.
It's a totally different interpretation. I would say, to really be honest about it, it's internal racism because it's more black than it is white in terms of how I would view it now and more where the power really existed. It's a deeper racism than you would see, and it goes back to you talking about the Carter G. Woodson. Not Carter, it was Carter G. Woodson in American history. Even in that, I mean, looking at the fact that we have a mayor's race and we're reinterpreting Harold Washington again, even though that legacy didn't produce what people thought that it did, it only produced more incompetence than it did competence. And that was it's an effigy of something that really didn't exist.
Wow. Yeah, this is a longer time. And Bill Ayers is sitting right here too, another portrait. And Bill, we were pretty much contemporaries, and trying to, he was willing to go a lot further than I was to resist the Vietnam War. And, but his model and his reasoning for trying to do what he did, and then his evolution from there to being, one of the really great educators in this country, along with Bernadine as a lawyer. When it came time to re-examine that period of my life and who the figures were who stood out to me at that time, who gave me the models and the strength to try to resist more, to be stand up higher. This was one of them right here, and extraordinary man. Thank you. Anything you want to say? Actually,